Hello, why am I making a video called How Not to Make a Nerd Environment? That's a good question. Imposter syndrome. So I love to go down ArtStation and just go, oh, what's people doing? How are they doing all this? People are making art all the time, but not me. And then you go to one, don't you? And you go, oh, I bet they did this in 4 months, but it'll take me 2 years. I bet they didn't get that thing where you go into like a little corner and it's flickering and you don't know why it's flickering and you look all over the place. There's no flickering anywhere else, but it is flickering there and you spend the days and days trying to troubleshoot it. So yeah, things go wrong. It's normal. This stuff is insanely difficult and always ever expanding. You'll never be perfect at everything, unless you're Ben Wilson. But the point of this video, I think, is to show how easy it is to make mistakes, and it's not just you that's making them. So this is the final scene. What you don't see in the renders is that there's no connection at the front. If you go to the sides, there's just this really hideous terrain. There's just lots of broken stuff like missing walls, misaligned pillars. Just a lot of messy junk. And I think a lot of that is just I was too tired by the end, probably burnt out. Because I spent over a year doing this, which seems mad to say now, because I think knowing what I know, I could do this in less than half the time. But yeah, this is the scene, but also that's the scene. So, what went wrong? I'm going to talk about reference, but not too much reference. I'll add a camera when the environment's done. Not respecting height values, getting too excited about textures, reviewing new textures in scene, being too proud to rescope. I'd come across this concept ahead of starting the project, so when I decided to do an environment course that centers around modular environments, this image came to mind. In hindsight, though, this image alone doesn't really scream modular. I mean, sure, it has these repeating arches, but for the most part, it's these two unique assets. Still, with smart gathering of references, you could still figure out how to turn this into a modular environment. But on its own as a reference, it's not one that really screams modular, and so it demands a lot in regards to filling in the gaps. I actually wrote out a list of themes to help guide my reference gather. I would still do this again. I think it's a great way to help refine the words that you use when you're searching for reference. But I think the key mistake I made is the amount of overlap with the keywords I highlighted. For example, temple and cathedral, which are two quite different things. My reference gather ended up being a mix of like temples, ruins. I think it's over here. Yeah, so like this architecture, it's kind of a mix of different stuff. You've got these ruins up here, but then it starts turning into cathedrals, dungeons, like almost like palaces, these old ancient Mayan temples, and if you go over here again, it's very like all over the place, really. Like if you compare this, which is very dungeony, gothic-y, and then you've got this, which is more of a sort of oriental feel to it. And as a result, I had a wide array of different shapes, patterns, structures, and so on. which would make my early blockouts feel like a mishmash of different eras and regions. So the key questions to ask yourself when starting a reference gather, regardless of it being fiction or non-fiction, I would say would be, what was the functionality of this place over time? And what is it now? When was it built? How much time has passed? Who built it? Where are we? Answering these questions will help determine what types of architecture to explore when referencing, as well as what kinds of shapes, colours, patterns to be looking for. If I could send a message to future me, I would say, if building a modular environment, your key references should inspire modular building in particular, i.e. concepts containing elements that you can foresee plenty of opportunities for repetition. Maintain your reference throughout. Don't be afraid to discard some later if no longer relevant, and this will help keep your reference focused. Avoid overlap if possible, i.e. multiple regions, styles, types of environments, and consider quality over quantity, even when it comes to reference images. I would say 1,000 images isn't necessarily better than 10 really good reference images. So, camera shots. It's something you should do very early on, which is something I didn't do because I got very caught up in the blockout and kept changing designs, which isn't a bad thing, but I was waiting for the blockout to be more finished before I started really playing with cameras, and I never felt like the blockout was perfect, so I kept putting it off. In hindsight, I should have really been playing with cameras even at this stage, and once I start establishing some interesting camera shots, I should be starting to build the environment out around those camera shots. And that's, of course, also going to save me time because then I'm not focused on areas that are not in those camera shots. And the other side of this is that by having a established camera shot or a few, you're going to have a lot better progress shots at the end. If you can see here, like, I'm all over the place in terms of angles and positions and distances, so it's very difficult to really understand the evolution of this environment. I think I really regretted that at the end. I wish I'd had just this one camera at least that I could have done my progress shots. I think if you are kind of building your environment and you later try to do camera shots but you can't find interesting camera shots, then something's probably wrong with the blockout itself. So future me, definitely play with camera shots very early on so that you can figure out the spaces more based on how you're actually going to present this thing at the end. But also, yeah, just the importance of having it so that you keep your progress shots consistent. Now, something you often hear when listening to experienced environment artists is the importance of a clean grid system. But one of the things that I kind of overlooked a little with this one was really determining the height values for the different floors. So, for example, like this main floor, it was always something that I had even early on in the first initial blockouts. But as you can see later, like there's a lot of changes to this. You can see, the difference between these two, right? You've got this one that's a lot more smaller, and then I really increased the length of it. This was actually a really good change that I made. But the problem is that I think I was finished with the block out probably around like this stage. And that's where I called it, like, this is the final block out. And then I started detailing it up. And I kind of left that stage too early, because I made these really significant changes, which meant I had to change the height of the pillars, I had to change the height of the railing that I'd made, I had to change the stairs that I made. And this happened like a few times. I made little changes like that, which had all these knockoff effects. Oh, another one is that if you look up here, like these tops were initially like very, even at the stage when it was the block out, and I'd moved on to the next stage, I hadn't, like, this wasn't finalized, right? I'd gone back later and changed this quite a bit, which meant I had to change the heights of the pillars. So, message to future me is, if your environment has multiple levels, you really need to determine the key height values as soon as possible. And when your block out is complete, just walk away from it. I think the worst thing you can do is just in your next session move on from the block out stage. Like, take time away and go back and review the block out, and just be absolutely confident that your height values are, at least your height values, are locked in as much as possible. So this one again is that same issue of moving on from the block out to the next stage too quickly. With the texture setup, I did have good intentions. I did this common practice of like, right, what pieces do I need? What do I need to texture? And like breaking it up into simple elements. But just like before, you can see this is quite an old block out. It's probably like around here that I did it. But as you know by now, things changed, which kind of made a lot of this redundant. Like, I was color coding elements that I would later delete. So again, like, just being really careful about that stage where you move from the block out to the detailing up to the next level. Now, this is a texture that I just made super quickly just to explain something. So when I was doing my placeholders on this environment, they were about this level where I would have color variation, I would have AO, curvature highlights, I would even have like little luminosity in there. And I just think that was just creating a lot of noise, and it was more difficult to troubleshoot my textures. I would actually think of a first pass more like this next time, where you're just focusing on what the main color is, the tone, the sizes, the shapes, and the spacing, and making sure that is applied all over the scene, and you're just making sure that the colors are working together, that the spacing is all cohesive and all that. Because I actually put in way too much. I was even doing normal maps and roughness maps as my placeholder. So message to future me would be to refine your placeholders to a bare minimum. Just focus on tones, shapes, spacing, and sizing. Bring up your textures in steps. And I actually think the AO and the curvature is really not that important in the grand scheme of things. I would add those towards your last stages. But yeah, the main thing is to make sure that your placeholders are very simple to begin with. more towards this rather than this. Yep, this old chestnut, so lots of green lighting, very atmospheric, contrasty shadows, which caused a lot of problems trying to review how my textures were working, especially with the albedo and the normals and the roughness. And I kept changing the lighting, I kept changing the materials, I kept changing this material in particular over and over and over and over again to try and work with my lighting, when really I should have probably been doing it the other way around. But eventually I came across this really useful article. I'll link to it in the description. And all it is just the idea of taking your materials into a completely new scene with very default lighting, very neutral lighting, a basic setup, a basic lighting setup, just to remove the amount of issues that could be causing problems with reading your materials. And something that I should mention, earlier on, I was doing a lot of my typical substances. So what I mean by that is very high contrast. These were made more with a portfolio mindset. So marmoset render, very crisp, very detailed, and really intense AO and all that, very high contrast. But it results in this kind of thing, which even here, maybe looks okay, but once you bring that into scene, this is a poor screenshot. It's from an old work in progress, but I think you can see already here, it's just way too noisy and detailed. So eventually I kind of came across another method of just really simplifying and trying to just avoid putting things like even curvature or AO in my textures. The AO in particular was very, very, very low in the end. But if you compare these two, right, the amount of detail in a normal map, I found it just works a lot better in big scenes. If you've got more simple shapes, the more simple the better, I find. So this was an early version of this. This is what I eventually did with the brick wall. Again, if you compare, it's more like this one as opposed to this one. And that just worked better for me. So here we have some bricks. This has the material blending, but I think you can still, even where it does show, you can still tell the difference, that it's just a lot easier on the eye. So what would I tell my future self? Don't tweak textures to work with your lighting. Tweak your lighting to work with your textures. So try and just stick to Substance Designer or whatever you're making your textures and review them there. And then bring them into like a material scene in a separate scene with neutral lighting. And also doing a scene like this, if you actually add all your props and materials, this is something I want to do in the future, but having a scene with all your materials and props could be really useful, because I found at the end when I was rushing, I just threw together this shot in Maya and it doesn't really do it justice. It would have been nice to have a better render for this shot in particular. So yeah, next time I'll definitely create a scene like this much earlier on. Originally, I wanted to do more than this at a higher quality within a year with a day job. This would ultimately lead to burnout, I think, and actually I came really close to abandoning the project twice, with a sense of just being overwhelmed by it all, and also just being excited about some new ideas that I had, and I wanted to do other environments along the way. I've done this before with other projects where progress feels so slow that I've just lost interest and I've moved on to something else. In actual game production, that's just not an option. You find a way. In game production, if there's simply not enough time, then you either get additional support or you rescope. So there were a few occasions where I rescoped, especially early on. I removed this whole entranceway that was like a corridor that led up to the main area. But that would have created just a lot of extra materials and assets and a lot more planning. Thankfully, I caught that pretty early, so didn't add too much details in there. So another thing would be this middle dividing wall, which would have been a good opportunity for decoration. But ultimately, I removed it because not just to save time, but actually I think it helped the scene. Because previously when it was in there, you couldn't see all the way through and you had to look at it from multiple angles to be able to work out what was at the back. And this open area just feels a lot better in my opinion. So that was a good rescope. Not only did it save time, but I felt like it improved the look of the environment. And if things are getting really, really bad, you could always just, rescope to something like this, right? And if that's too much, you can rescope to where, it's not here, but it could just be like a wall, floor, a pillar, and some props. So that's the maximum that you could probably rescope. But I think I got a good balance. I didn't get the statue thing that I kind of originally wanted in the original concept, but these rescopes just made it a lot more manageable to me and made me less overwhelmed. Message to future me: avoid entirely dropping a project at all costs. It's healthier to heavily rescope than it is to just discard everything. If new to the industry, this is good practice for learning how and where to rescope and being good at identifying what's important for the project. If you're learning loads of new pipelines, avoid doing a large environment. Start small, expand your environments as you gain confidence with the tools that you're using. Next time, I'd rather start much smaller and only expand if I'm not burnt out at the end and still excited. Avoid long sessions. Again, treat it like a job. Don't do overtime, or the longer the session, the more likely you'll end on a bad note. If you plan to have a 90-minute session and you finish at something like 70 minutes, stop, run away. End on a positive note and you'll be eager to return. And finally, be kind to myself. Take a pause to identify the wins along the way. Label them even. I just put these together now. I wish I'd done this throughout the project, because I'll probably have 100 of these, and that would have probably helped my mindset a lot, instead of thinking that the environment's not progressing, but being able to see that my skills would have probably helped push me through. It's funny because I actually did label all my mistakes along the way. Don't know why I did that. Although it did prove useful in this case, because I was able to make a video called How Not to Make an Environment. Okay, so that's it for this video. Feel free to ask questions or raise your own thoughts about anything I mentioned in the comments, and I'll try to get back to you.